everyone. Welcome to a short podcast by myself, Stephanie Coker. I'm a barrister at 5SAH and I practice in family law. I'm joined by my colleague, Dave Williams, and this podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Black Cultural Archives. Dave, you can introduce yourself.
My name's David Williams and I'm a barrister specialising in crime and extradition and other allied human rights cases.
Thank you. So our talk will be in two parts. I will begin by setting out the case dealing with no slavery on English soil. It's the case of Somerset and Stewart. And then I'll pass it on to Dave. He will speak about how slavery might be closer to our everyday lives and how we can think about these things if we observe them around us. So I'll start off by looking at the case. So in 1772, in England, there was a case of Somerset and Stewart. I'll go through the facts very briefly. So this was an English judgment at the King's Bench. The case concerned an 8-year-old boy, James Somerset, from West Africa. He was enslaved and purchased by Mr. Stewart, who was a customs officer when in Boston, America. Now, Somerset was brought by Stewart when he returned to England in 1761. And 3 years later, Somerset escaped. So Somerset was later recaptured, and Stewart had him in prison on a ship on its way to Jamaica. And this ship was owned by Captain Knowles. So thereafter, Stewart directs that Somerset was sold to a plantation. So having this occurred, Stewart then wanted to have him returned. So Somerset's godparents made an application to the King's Bench for a writ of habeas corpus, which basically means they want the body to be returned because he was imprisoned unlawfully. The application was actually made against the ship captain, Mr. Knowles, because Somerset was on his ship at the time. And after the application was made, Captain Knowles produced Somerset before the court. So the issue to determine was basically whether Somerset's imprisonment was lawful or not. Advocates for Somerset argued that while slavery might have been permitted by colonial laws, neither English common law nor any statutory law or positive law made at the time by Parliament allowed slavery, and therefore slavery was unlawful. There were also arguments made from a contract law perspective. So it was said on his behalf that English contract law did not allow any person to enslave himself, nor could any person or nor could any contract be binding upon a person by their consent. Lawyers for Mr. Stewart did not advance arguments based on contract law, but on property law. So they argued that there was a right to a Black person as a slave, and that property was paramount. So having heard arguments from both sides, Lord Mansfield, who was the Chief Justice of the King's Bench at the time, gave the decision that Somerset should be discharged. Now, the key remarks from that passage and decision is as follows. So he basically said, the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of now being introduced by the courts of justice upon mere reasoning or inferences from any principles, natural or political. It must take its rise from positive law. The origin of it can in no country or age be traced back to any other source. Immemorial usage preserves the memory of positive law long after all traces of the occasion, reason, authority, and time of its instruction are lost. And in a case so odious as the condition of slaves must be taken strictly. The power claimed by this return was never in use here. No master ever was allowed here to take a slave by force to be sold abroad because he had departed from his service, or for any other reason whatever. We cannot say the cause set forth by this return is allowed or approved by the laws of this kingdom, therefore the Black must be discharged. So essentially what was decided was that there was no positive law, there was no statute or act of Parliament at the time allowing slavery or allowing a master to take an individual against their will and to be sold because they had basically left their service. Now, the court did not go as far as saying that slavery was illegal or it should be abolished. So it has been argued, well, was this case significant? Is it right to say there's no more slavery on English soil? Now, where does this leave us? Can we say that there's no modern day slavery? I think that's a good point to pass on to Dave. Dave, over to you.
In the second half of what we've got to talk about, I want to explain a little bit about the circumstances where exploitation is used to keep people serving various aims other than those which they might choose themselves, and the mechanisms by which that is sort of persisting in places all around the UK, much more close than we think. And in talking about that, I don't draw any particular comparison to the appalling slavery of 150 or 200 years ago, less in some parts of the world. But what I do want to make clear is that there are elements of our society, there are parts of people employed, engaged, or entrapped near us, the circumstances which probably are known to us, but are that they are being exploited. They're being sometimes detained against their will. And it's worth, in light of that decision, which Stephanie's just spoken about, thinking about whether it can then or now really be said that there are no people in those appallingly desperate situations in the UK. A lot of there's types of situations where people may be considered to be victims of modern slavery are established by tests set out now in the Modern Slavery Act. Although the genus of the Modern Slavery Act flows from a number of international instruments which the UK government decided to commit to, both European and international instruments more broadly, which recognise that across the world, there are people who are trafficked, there are people who are exploited to the extent that they need to be considered as victims, because very often the work that they are forced to undertake is itself criminal. And against that backdrop, in criminal practice in England and Wales, we come across a significant number of those circumstances. Just as examples, ones that you may have read about or think more readily about are things like being trafficked into sex work, which is obviously appalling and not something that we'll go into. It's way outside the scope of this conversation today. But the other pretty common criminal enterprise which people are trafficked into is cannabis grows. We're recording this in December 2022, and there's snow everywhere. And one of the ways in which cannabis grows often come to light are in the heat of those grows being revealed through roofs which are poorly insulated, and therefore the snow melts. But those cannabis grows are all over the UK. They're not limited to, for example, rural and remote locations or big populous towns. They are of varying sizes all over the country in all sorts of properties. And very often the people who are involved in actually tending to those plants, the gardeners, as we call them, have been trafficked into that position, often internationally trafficked through some very dangerous routes across, in some cases, right the way across Asia and then through Europe. Cannabis grows are very often situations where people are locked into those premises. So they are absolutely in a situation where their freedom is removed. And some of those are really appalling conditions. Something which is a little less common in the press, but perhaps no less common in practice, is domestic servitude. And although that's not a part of the experience of many of us living in England and Wales, I say England and Wales because that's the criminal jurisdiction that I practice in. But yeah, there are still a lot of domestic servants or people in domestic servitude, despite the fact that for many of us, that's not a part of life. And in some cases, that's to do with cultural expectations. And domestic servitude is one of those areas of modern exploitation where people can be born into an expectation of domestic servitude. So in some cases, I'm afraid it's still the situation that people are the children of domestic servants, and they are expected themselves to then become domestic servants in the same context often than their parents. And it really very great credit goes to Samo Farah for revealing a little of his situation as a younger man, and revealing that that's something which is unfortunately very much still a part of life for certain parts of those living in London and other communities around the UK. Another feature, there have been a number of well-publicised cases of absolute detention over the last few years in an agricultural setting, and across England and Wales in rural communities, on farms. There are a number of migrant workers who have been retained in farms in circumstances that eventually become exploitation. And in some cases, people are trafficked into those environments, generally from Europe, and are then exploited in a way which is criminal in this jurisdiction. And so we have people across agriculture who find themselves not being properly paid. There are other circumstances, so other businesses where it's very easy, and there is a culture or a network established to help hide people who are being exploited. And I'm afraid it's not just a cliche to say that that includes nail bars. And there is a particular link to sophisticated trafficking networks from certain parts of Asia into those positions. And then also in hand car washes, because obviously it's a cash business, often relatively informal or on a piece of wasteland or other semi-industrial locations, and the turnover of staff there, the record keeping and so on is such that it's a good location or an easy location for people to be exploited through their work, really to profit others. Some different examples which are perhaps less publicised, although in the last year or so, again, there have been a couple of cases, one of which is a trial I was involved in that took some time at Southwark in London, related to people being trafficked into construction work. And I can give some slightly more detailed examples there, but across just 2 criminal cases prosecuted in 2019, 2021, that finished trials at the end of 2021, there were examples of about 100 or more people trafficked from Eastern European jurisdictions to come and work as subcontractors in construction in London. And we know that, or experience tells us that, those schemes are likely to be the few that got caught. It's a very effective way of exploiting vulnerable and low-paid foreign nationals. Those people are offered a rate of pay which may be better than that which they could achieve in their home jurisdiction in London, but they're brought to London. They're paid less than the minimum wage. They are often kept in difficult or overcrowded accommodation, or they're kept in reasonable accommodation but charged through the nose for it out of their wages, so that in effect they're never able to pay off debts which are inflated. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the features of all of these places that we might find relevant exploitation or modern slavery at the moment in a second. But yeah, unfortunately, the construction industry is marred by really significant exploitation of workers who are modern slaves, and would you be amazed at the types of institution or the types of places that they've worked. So, for example, I know from the case I was involved in, some very smart hotels, some very smart basement renovations in expensive West End properties, and some redevelopment around the Olympic sites and so on. And the problem there really is that there's just a race to the bottom for wages for construction workers. The same is true in the UK in restaurant catering and other kind of commercial food settings, that their kitchens are a very good place to hide exploited workers. And again, that often comes with the problems of tied accommodation that I'll speak about in a moment. And then just retail. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where retail workers in a number of settings are also trafficked and exploited. And so it's right to acknowledge that actually very close to us, probably wherever we are living our lives in England and Wales, there are likely to be people who are being exploited to differing degrees, but in appalling ways, sometimes in the most appalling ways, and sometimes with their liberty absolutely curtailed. And so to think that we can live our lives absent touching that exploitation is a fallacy. I mean, it's just impossible to kind of go about day-to-day business without ever making a decision which is actually in part helping those who exploit people to profit from your investment. So, you know, I would encourage anybody to think about that in the decisions that they make. And I'd also encourage everybody to reach out to the resources that there are on the internet and hear the voices of those people who have been exploited, because obviously that's not me. I'm not in that unfortunate position. And I think it's important that people get a real understanding of the voices of the people who have been through that, rather than taking it from me. So please use this as an opportunity to go and give your ears to those voices, so that you actually have some proper understanding of how that exploitation may be happening around you. And I'm sure you'll find news articles wherever you are in the country that give you a bit more information about things that have happened close enough to home for you to have a think about these issues. Now, the themes that run through those circumstances of the types of people who we in a criminal context would consider to have been criminally exploited or the victims of modern slavery are themes which are all too familiar for those who've been exploited for a really significant amount of time in societies all over the world. But it's not always actual detention, as I've said, but actual detention, being a prisoner, being forced to stay in an environment, having control of locks, being dealt with by somebody else, not being able to get out of the room that you're kept in, other than to perform functions as directed. A number of those types of exploitation or circumstances or places of exploitation I've spoken about do involve that degree of detention. Very often there's a geographical or physical location element, which we call trafficking. And generally speaking, when we talk about trafficking, we're talking about somebody being moved from one location to another to be exploited by an individual or groups to do something on their behalf. And obviously, in a lot of the cases that I've been talking about, we're talking about a sort of diaspora or a moving of people from their cultural or just country of origin into another location where they feel more vulnerable, where they are more vulnerable, where there's a language barrier, where it's less likely that they'll be able to engage with the police or other agencies. And it's that physical movement and the isolation that flows from that the exploiters can then leverage to be more sure that they will be able to exploit the people for long enough in the way that they want to. And that's the first of many barriers that are put up to make people feel helpless, to remove their own will, to remove the effective decisions that they have. And from the point of view of having represented a very significant number of foreign nationals in vulnerable positions in the UK, I find it really frustrating that the criminal justice process in England and Wales is so poor at recognising how difficult it might be to run away from a situation or to speak out when you're in a situation. The expectation of privilege and largely white privilege in England and Wales and our court system, which acts as an unfair lens through which to judge the actions of very vulnerable people, I think is something that we're not doing very well at the moment. So, for example, you might have an adult who's been trafficked to work in a cannabis grow. They might have spent sometimes 5, 6, 7 or 8 months being trafficked in the back of lorries from Asia to the UK. They might have lived in various safe houses. I mean, they're not safe for the people who are trafficked. They're safe for the criminals, hidden from view of law enforcement agencies. But they've effectively been groomed and been through this huge trauma, and then to expect them to be able to escape the confines of a cannabis grow or to fight back or push their way out, or that's unrealistic. Sometimes a big part of what's happened has been the conditioning, for example, through violence, to know that if you try and move, if you try and open the door, even if the key is in it, there'll be repercussions for you. And so those are the kind of features of some of that trafficking, which I don't think we deal with very well. And also, I think we don't understand how difficult it is to think what your options might be if you don't speak a word of the language in the jurisdiction that you're in. And again, we just need to realize some of the people in those situations don't know the country that they're in. They don't know that they have arrived in the UK. They think that they could be at any one of a number of stops on the lorry hopping journey that they've taken along the way. When we come to exploitation in other contexts, so often in relation to things like construction industry, absolutely certainly, restaurants, shops, nail bars, it's what we would call in the legitimate practice of employment, tied accommodation. So accommodation provided by the exploiters is another way in which they put up a layer of protection around the circumstances that they will use to try and seek to exploit someone, and a layer of protection against that person feeling that they're able to leave. So it's the exploiter who provides the accommodation. That might be a flat above the shop where somebody's being forced to work, or the kitchen. It might be a location, a rented house, you know, a Victorian terrace in London designed with 3 bedrooms with 24 or 30 men living in bunk beds in that accommodation. It varies across various schemes, but that accommodation will often include the provision of food, sometimes good, sometimes appalling. And it's the provision of that shelter, those basic needs, that is often the carrot which brings people from vulnerable positions of low paid work abroad to the UK. But it's also then something which ties them. They haven't got anywhere to go. There's nowhere safe to run aside from that accommodation. And again, that links through to one of the most common ways of securing exploitative practice and exploiting people, which is debt bondage. So that's alleging debts. So saying that the people who you've trafficked, well, you owe us money for your flights, you owe us money for the journey. Your family paid $10,000 to have you trafficked to the UK. They didn't pay us that money up front. We now need you to work for us to pay off that debt. You know, 6 months later, no, you've not actually paid off anything of that debt, because the money that you have achieved through the work that we've put you to is only paying for your accommodation, or you've only paid off $1,000 of the $11,000 because of that. You know, we have to pay for your food, we pay for your drinks. And another feature of that is encouragement into debt. And we'll have seen that a little bit given the kind of financial situation at the moment, you know, loan sharks approaching people at food banks. It's similar. So you're in the position of exploitation, you're working in construction in London and being exploited, and your exploiter is saying to you, yeah, you can have a phone. I'll buy you a mobile phone. No problem. I'll buy the new iPhone. That's £1,000. Knowing full well that in the context of the money that you're earning, you're never going to be able to pay them back a debt of £1,000. You're never going to have that. And so they can hold that debt over you for longer and longer and longer. So that debt bondage, inflation of debts, you know, another example in construction context is that where you've got migrant workers who wouldn't perhaps otherwise pass the CSCS test, the green card test, which is like a site certificate test, they will pay for a corrupt CSCS test center to give you an unfailable test, but that will cost you £200 or £300. And then again, that debt is added to your chit, you know, and it's said, no, you've not paid it off. And they know full well you're never going to pay off those debts. So it's those sorts of tricks or schemes that are used to keep people in that feeling of kind of desperation, like they've got nowhere to go, they can't get out. And then finally, you've got really obvious things like retention of documents. So the taking of passports. Yeah, I need to take your passport so that we can get you the right to work. I'm going to take your documents so that we can, you know, I'm going to give them to your employer so that they've got them. And then as soon as those documents are removed, again, it's just another barrier put up to somebody actually being able to make the choice to walk out of the situation that they find themselves in. And then the final thing is that I'm afraid to say there are still societal, cultural, hierarchical structures in some of these environments that make it very difficult for people to leave or take choices against the people who are exploiting them. And so, you know, wherever there is exploitation, you can be sure that the ingenuity of the exploiter is pretty intense. But those are the kind of common themes. Some of them, as you can imagine, are pretty age old. But it's those things that really cause people to remain in desperate situations for a long time in a lot of those contexts that I've spoken about. So all of those things are happening, I'm afraid, all around us. And just to sort of draw that together, the idea that legally speaking, there's no slavery on British soil is plainly still not true. And I'm afraid there's a lot more that we can do, both as individuals and particularly from my point of view as a criminal justice system, to better reflect the reality. And you know, we play a part of that as practitioners, the courts play a part of that, investigative agencies need to play a part in that. But the situation is, I'm afraid, that there is really significant exploitation, never very far away. But just to draw that together finally, please go online and look at, as I said, look at the resources available and listen to the voices. Use this as a gateway in to listen to the voices of those people who have been exploited, perhaps in your community, and get a better understanding of how that's happening, and think about what we can do together, and what you can do in your community to try and rid ourselves of these things, and stop being blind to it. Stop turning a blind eye to where things don't look right, and where people don't appear to be treated well in our environments or our surroundings. I think if you have those feelings, then think about them a little bit more and think about how it's possible that people could be exploited and that you might withdraw your support.